This video contains the solutions to the Lesson 6-4 Day 2 assignment. The first few problems are similar to yesterday's problems, but then we'll move to working with least common denominator, and at that point the two steps that you see on screen will become helpful. So first of all, number 2, we're starting with the fraction 4/9 and want to change it to an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 27. To change 9 into 27, it's necessary to times by 3. When you do that in the top, you end up getting a 12 as the numerator. 12 over 27 is equal to 4 over 9. Problem 6, we want to change the first fraction with a denominator of 5 into an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 25. You need to times by 5. If you times the top by 5 as well, you will get 5 parentheses 2n minus 5. Number 14, same thing. Change the first fraction into an equivalent fraction with the new denominator. It looks like what we're lacking is another 3y minus 2 factor. And so if you multiply the top also by 3y minus 2, you figure out that the missing part of this fraction is 2y parentheses 3y minus 2. And number 18 is the same idea. Find a fraction that's equivalent to 5 over n minus 3, but has this new denominator. N squared minus 9 is the difference of squares. It factors as n plus 3 times n minus 3. Comparing the two denominators, we can see that the first fraction has the n minus 3, but is missing the n plus 3. So we decide to multiply by n plus 3, and in the top. So our new fraction needs to have the numerator 5, and then in parentheses, n plus 3. Now in all of those problems, we had a fraction given to us to begin with, and then we wanted to change it to a new fraction, and we were told what the denominator of the new fraction is. Now let's switch gears. Number 21, find the least common denominator of these two fractions, 1/6 and 5/9. So first of all, we're interested in the denominators, not the numerators. All of our attention needs to go to the 6 and the 9. We don't care about the 1 and the 5. Now, if one number is 6 and the other number is 9, we're looking for the least common multiple of 6 and 9. Well, what are the multiples of 6? The first multiple of 6 is the number 6 itself. The second multiple of 6 is 6 times 2, which is 12. The third multiple of 6 is 6 times 3, which is 18. The fourth multiple of 6 is 6 times 4, which is 24. Dot, 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 and so on, right? All of these numbers are multiples of 6. Now, what numbers are the multiples of 9? Well, the first multiple of 9 is 9 itself. That's 9 times 1. 9 times 2 is 18. 9 times 3 is 27. 9 times 4 is 36. Dot, dot, dot. This list continues. Now we're looking for the least common multiple of 6 and 9. What is the least number that's common to both lists of multiples? That is the number 18. The least common multiple of 6 and 9 is 18. That is the least denominator that we could choose that would be a common denominator. So we're asked for the LCD, least common denominator, and that is 18. An LCD is the least common multiple of the denominators. Now, hopefully when you have numbers like 6 and 9, you don't have to list on paper the multiples in order to find the first one that's common. This is something that ideally you would do in your head. You can also do this on the calculator if you use the TI-84 calculator, the same way that we found greatest common factor with that calculator. You push the math menu, you scroll over to num, and then in that same menu that had the greatest common factor, you will find LCM, least common multiple. Now number 25. We have two fractions. They don't have the same denominator. One denominator is 8. The other denominator is 12. What's the least common denominator? Well, what's the least common multiple of 8 and 12? 8 times 1 is 8. 8 times 2 is 16. 8 times 3 is 24. 12 times 1 is 12. 12 times 2 is 24. 24 is the least number that is a common multiple. So the LCD is 24. This is going to connect to the next lesson, adding and subtracting fractions. If we were asked to add together or subtract together these two fractions in problem 25, we can't add or subtract them when one of them has an 8 in the bottom and the other has a 12 in the bottom. But if we can transform the fractions so that they both have the number 24 in the bottom, then we can add or subtract them. Now number 30, what's the LCD of these two fractions? Finally, the step 2 up above comes into play. Let's take a look at that. The LCD is the product of the greatest power of each factor that appears in the denominators. So let's look at what factors appear in the denominators. In the first denominator, the factor that appears is b plus 5. In the second denominator, the factor that appears is b minus 5. We're going to create a product using those two factors. Product just means multiply them together. So b plus 5 times b minus 5. That is the LCD. It's the least common multiple of the denominators of these fractions. Now, number 35, the directions are going to change again. This time we want to rewrite the fractions using their LCD. So we first need to figure out what is the LCD, and then we need to transform the fractions to an equivalent fraction that has that LCD. So first thing, what is the LCD? It is formed by using all of the factors that appear in the denominators. And when the same factor appears in both denominators, such as the letter x, using the highest power that appears. The LCD will contain a 2 from the first fraction. It will contain an x to the second power from the second fraction. And it will contain the letter y from the first fraction. The LCD is the product of all of the factors that are in the denominators. And when there's a common factor like x, you use the highest exponent that appears in the denominators. Now that we know what the LCD is, we can change both of our fractions to have that LCD. Let's take a look at our first fraction. It already has the denominator 2xy, but we need to change it so it has the denominator 2x squared y. What is it missing? What do we need to multiply by to have 2x squared y? We're short 1x. We need another x. So we're going to multiply by x and in the top. Over on the side in red ink, I'm going to write down what's created. X over 2x squared y. That is the first fraction transformed into an equal fraction, but with the desired denominator. Now let's look at our second fraction, 3 over x squared, and rewrite it so that it has the least common denominator. We're missing the 2 and the y. We've already got the x squared. We're just missing the 2 and the y. Multiply the top by 2y as well. So over on the right side in red ink, we get 6y over the 2x squared y. That's this second fraction, rewritten so it has the denominator that we're interested in. All right, number 37. Our first fraction is 5 over x minus 3, and our second fraction is 7 over 4x minus 12. The 4x minus 12 is not in factored form, so right underneath, let's factor it. There's a GCF of 4. and we get 4 times x minus 3. Now, what is the least common denominator going to be? It's going to be the product of all of the factors that appear in the denominators. There's an x minus 3 that appears in both denominators, and there's also a 4 that appears in the denominator. So the LCD is 4 times x minus 3. Now let's make our transformations. Look at the first fraction, the 5 over x minus 3. It already has the x minus 3, but what it's lacking is the 4. So times by 4, and in the top. So over on the right side, our fraction becomes 20 over 4 times x minus 3. Now let's look at our second fraction, the 7 over 4x minus 12. That already has the least common denominator. So we don't need to make any changes to that fraction. We're just going to keep that one the same. It's 7 over 4 times x minus 3. Now, looking at these two results, you can maybe anticipate what our next lesson is going to be about when we add or subtract fractions. Once we've made these transformations and the denominators are now identical, imagine adding them. 20 plus 7 makes 27 in the top, and the bottom will be that least common denominator. Or imagine subtracting these two fractions that have the same denominator. 20 minus 7, you're going to get 13 in the top, and the bottom will be the least common denominator. That's coming up in the next lesson. Now number 39. Rewrite these fractions so that they have an LCD. Well, what is the LCD? It is going to be a product containing all of the factors that are in the denominators, and when there is a factor common to both, which there is here, x minus 3 and x minus 3, you use the highest power that appears on that common factor. So the LCD is x minus 3 to the second power. Now that we know what least common denominator we want, we can change our first fraction so that it has that denominator. It already has one x minus 3 in the bottom. It just needs another one. And multiply the top by that same thing. So over on the right, that fraction changes into 6 parentheses x minus 3 over our common denominator. The second fraction already has the least common denominator that's desired, so we don't change it at all. It stays as 4x over the x minus 3 squared. Number 41. In the denominators, I notice they're not yet in factored form. So the first one has a GCF of 2 and can be rewritten as 2 times y minus 2. The second fraction's denominator is a difference of squares, and it factors as y plus 2 times y minus 2. Now, let's figure out what the LCD is going to contain. It needs to have all of the factors that are in the denominators. The first fraction contributes a 2. There is a y minus 2 factor that is in both denominators. And then the second fraction contributes the factor y plus 2. This is the least common denominator. Now go back to the first fraction. What do you need to multiply by in the denominator in order to change it to the least common denominator? You already have the 2, you already have the y minus 2. It's missing the y plus 2. And multiply by that in the top. Over on the right side of the screen, we've created 3y parentheses y plus 2 over our least common denominator. Now our second fraction. Is its denominator missing any parts in order to match up with the least common denominator? It's missing the 2. Need to times by 2. And in the top. So our second fraction transforms into 2 over the least common denominator. Now again, try to anticipate the upcoming lesson. What if there was a plus sign written between these two fractions? If the fractions have the same denominator, then you would add the numerators together and keep the common denominator. This concludes the video for this lesson.